It's Friday afternoon and you're on your way home from school. You find yourself rushing home a little quicker than you used to because of what is waiting on TV for you. New cartoons have hit the airwaves and they're unlike anything you've ever seen before. Not only that, but tomorrow is Saturday, and Saturday mornings have also become a sacred weekly ritual. The new cartoons hitting the airwaves have created a definitive seismic shift, and they're connected to all the new things you're seeing in toy stores and in commercials. It's 3 years into a new decade and a lot is going on, especially in the world of technology, as this is a year that produces a few innovations that, little do you know at the time, will eventually change your life forever. I'm Jamie Logie, and this is Everything 80s, a podcast that looks back on a decade that forever changed the way we dress, consumed, and connected. And today we travel back to revisit the movies, TV shows, music, tech, and sports from a pretty tumultuous but remarkable year. This is the history of 1983. Our focus here is on the notable pop culture moments from 1983, but we'll start with a quick look at some of the major world events that took place. Ronald Reagan announces his Strategic Defense Initiative, which many would dub the Star Wars program. Richard Noble sets the land speed record at 633 miles per hour. In April, the Space Shuttle Challenger is launched on its maiden flight. Swatch introduces its iconic swatches. Great Britain releases the pound coin, weighing down pockets from that point forward. Cats wins Best Musical at the Tonys. Milk is $1.35 a gallon. Monthly rent around $335, and a gallon of gas costs around 96 cents. But we begin with the world of cartoons, and 1983 may be the year that truly kicks off the cartoon revolution of the 80s. And it even gave us a bit of controversy. 1983 is the year that featured the release of many shows that became cornerstones of the decade. Shows that also represent the gigantic marketing shift also happening in children's entertainment. We're now getting into the era when Saturday morning cartoons are becoming bigger than ever. This is the year that gives us some of the biggest properties of the 1980s. Properties that will still be with us for decades to come. Just some of the cartoons that came out in 1983 include the one that many parents weren't exactly thrilled about.
That was Venger, the force of evil. I am Dungeon Master, your guide in the realm of Dungeons and Dragons.
Not only was the Dungeons and Dragons cartoon one of the few shows to not have a theme song, but it emerged during an era of satanic panic. Because of this fear, Dungeons and Dragons seemed to be one of the main targets. Fear regarding satanic cults had been building for a little while, and the year before the cartoon came out, a movie starring Tom Hanks called Mazes and Monsters aired on network TV. The made-for-TV movie is about a group of college students and their love of a fantasy role-playing game. A huge viewing audience saw the film explore connections between role-playing games and their possible relation to psychological problems. For many, this was the first time they had become aware of this issue. And a game like Dungeons and Dragons further became a scapegoat for the public's fear. The release of a children's cartoon show in 1983 didn't help matters, as also in 1983, a campaign was formed called BAD, Bothered Against Dungeons and Dragons. Censors and parental groups wanted warnings ahead of the cartoon show because of its supposed link to violence and witchcraft. It did run for a few seasons, and even though the Dungeons & Dragons cartoon didn't have a catchy theme song at the beginning, another new cartoon from 1983 gave us one of the most famous theme songs of the entire 1980s. Along with Inspector Gadget, other new cartoons that hit the airwaves in 1983 include Alvin and the Chipmunks, The Littles, the new Scooby and Scrappy Doo show, and the Charlie Brown and Snoopy show. In the UK, 1983 is when you got Banana Man and Super Ted. There was also the Mr. T cartoon and Rubik the Amazing Cube. If you didn't grow up in the early 80s, the Rubik's Cube was so popular that it led to its very own cartoon series about a sentient Rubik's Cube named Rubik, and it featured a theme song performed by Menudo.
Hello, my name is Rubik.
1983 also gave us The Dukes, the cartoon version of the Dukes of Hazzard, and of course, two of the most notable cartoon series of all time.
We'll fight for freedom wherever there's trouble. G.I. Joe is there. G.I. Joe, American hero.
The other big show to debut is everyone's favorite Prince of Eternia.
My magic sword and said, "By the power of Grayskull."
If you grew up in the UK during this time, not only did you get Banana Man and Super Ted, you got He-Man and the Masters of the Universe before it aired here in North America starting in September 1983. Saturday mornings and after school were quickly becoming must-see TV for kids more than ever. The seemingly endless amount of new cartoons that were well received by kids but not necessarily by parents were becoming can't-miss television. Saturday mornings were also quickly becoming a full institution of its own, and as advertising restrictions to children are being lifted, more and more shows follow. To me, 1983 is the most significant year for cartoons in the 80s, as not only did many era-defining shows come out, but they perfected the model of commercials posing as cartoon shows for the subsequent merchandising tie-ins. We move from the cartoons of 1983 to some of the notable movies, specifically one gigantic one. But before we get to that, we have to recognize the biggest movie of all time that was released the year prior. Released in 1982, E.T. the Extraterrestrial was the film that dethroned Star Wars as the highest-grossing movie of all time. E.T. would hold the record until another movie by Steven Spielberg dethroned it, Jurassic Park. Back in the early 80s, with home video not fully established yet, studios made more revenue through theatrical re-releases. Since the VCR was not commonplace in most homes yet, the only way to see a movie again and again was by going back to theaters. According to Box Office Mojo, E.T. was still in the top 20 highest-grossing films of 1983. It finished the year at number 16, bringing in more than $45 million. In today's money, that's $140 million. A remarkable amount for a movie that came out in June of the previous year. So E.T. is still going strong, but 1983 belongs to the final installment of a franchise that had blown many people's minds. It started out with the word revenge in the title. But after George Lucas decided that a Jedi doesn't take revenge, the name of the movie was changed to Return of the Jedi. Return of the Jedi came out in May 1983. But the name change was such a late addition that some of the earlier promotional material, like posters and trailers, still included revenge in the title.
Revenge of the Jedi. Coming May 25th to a theater in your galaxy.
In the final chapter of Star Wars, or so we thought at the time, we see the full journey of Luke Skywalker. We see the end of both Darth Vader, the Emperor, and the Death Star. This is also the film that introduced us to the Ewoks. The visual technology in Return of the Jedi had grown in leaps and bounds since A New Hope released 6 years prior. The visual effects were more impressive than ever. Return of the Jedi was the hands-down highest-grossing film of 1983. Box Office Mojo has Return of the Jedi at over $475 million for its worldwide box office. Adjusted for inflation, that's nearly $1.5 billion. Again, as far as we knew, that was it for Star Wars movies, making it a bittersweet end for one of the most important movie franchises in history. Return of the Jedi dominated theaters in 1983, but there were still some other notable movie releases. Here are a few. What happens when a kid is playing what he thinks is a video game, but accidentally almost starts World War III? This was the premise of War Games, a Cold War-based movie that combined the immense popularity of video games into a genuine techno-thriller. Starring Matthew Broderick and Ali Sheedy, War Games came out in the summer of 1983 and was kind of a surprise hit, making nearly $80 million on a budget of just around $12. This box office success made it the 5th highest grossing film of the year. A pretty impressive result considering some of the other big movies of the year included Tootsie, Flashdance, Trading Places, Risky Business, Superman 3, Sophie's Choice, The Dark Crystal, and Scarface. And also add to that list, even though it came out right at the end of 1982, Gandhi. 1983 also gave us a movie that would become one of the definitive holiday movies of all time, and a must-watch every year for people to this day, A Christmas Story. A Christmas Story is all about young Ralphie, a kid growing up in the 1940s that wants nothing more for Christmas than a Red Ryder BB gun. Like a lot of beloved classics, A Christmas Story was not exactly a blockbuster smash when it opened in November 1983. It was still a moneymaker, but finished at number 53 for the highest grossing films of the year. But after it eventually aired more and more on TV, the legacy of A Christmas Story very slowly grew. And today, for many people, it's not the holidays without it. Speaking of movies, let's look at the 1983 Oscars, which the film Gandhi dominated. At the 55th Academy Awards, Best Picture went to Gandhi, the Best Actor went to Ben Kingsley for Gandhi, and Best Director went to Richard Attenborough for Gandhi. Best Actress went to Meryl Streep for Sophie's Choice. Best Supporting Actor went to Louis Gossett Jr. for An Officer and a Gentleman. And Best Supporting Actress went to Jessica Lange for Tootsie. We now move over to the music of 1983, which kind of mirrors 1983 at the movies. Just as E.T. was released in 1982 but continued to be a force in 1983, so was the case for Michael Jackson's Thriller. Even though it came out in '82, the monumental album still dominated the charts in 1983. Thriller came out in November '82, but it was the best-selling album of 1983. According to Billboard, it stayed at number 1 for 22 non-consecutive weeks, which included 17 straight weeks at number 1. For almost half the year, Thriller was the most dominant album in music. But looking back at the top songs of 1983, Billboard has Every Breath You Take by The Police at number 1. But Billie Jean by Michael Jackson finished the year at number 2, and Beat It finished in 5th. In 3rd place that year was Flashdance What a Feeling by Irene Cara, and number 4 was Down Under by Men at Work. So besides Thriller, here's what bestsellingalbums.org has as the other top-selling albums of 1983. Topping the sales charts, after Thriller, is Can't Slow Me Down by Lionel Richie, Synchronicity by The Police, Color by Numbers by Culture Club, She's So Unusual by Cyndi Lauper, Eliminator by ZZ Top, one of my favorites ever, Pyromania by Def Leppard, Let's Dance by David Bowie, Sports by Huey Lewis and the News, Frontiers by Journey, and the debut album by the unique new artist from Michigan that was about to take the 80s by storm, Madonna. So that's the music of 1983. And coming up next, two of the most important innovations in the history of tech. Innovations that changed our world possibly more than anything in the last century. We now move into the world of technology. In 1983, maybe one of the most significant years in technological advancements ever. This is specifically for two creations that had a bigger impact on our world than anyone could have predicted at the time. The first thing, however, is not a physical object. Even though it was a continually evolving thing, 1983 can technically be the year that gave birth to the internet. The University System of Georgia from usg.edu states that January 1st, 1983 is the official birthday of the internet. Why? Because before this, computer networks didn't have a standard way to connect with each other. Leading up to the 80s, ARPANET, or the Advanced Research Projects Agency Network, was used to share information. But its use was limited. This all changed with the establishment of a new protocol, the Transfer Control Protocol and the Internetwork Protocol, or TCP, and something you're probably familiar with now, IP. Now, various types of computers on different networks could basically talk to each other. January 1st, 1983 is also significant because this is when ARPANET and the Defense Data Network changed to the new standard. It's still years until the World Wide Web and the internet as we know it, but it's on its way. And January 1st, 1983 remains a red-letter day in the history of science. Speaking of computers, 1983 is also considered a very important year in the history of computing. It's the year that computerhistory.org calls something of a golden age for personal computer consumers. By this point, machines like the IBM PC 5150, the Commodore 64, the Apple II, and the TRS-80 are still going strong. But more innovation is quickly happening. 1983 is a year that gave us the Apple Lisa.
Lisa from Apple. So advanced it puts us right back where we started.
The nearly $10,000 machine has been called Apple's most influential failure. Promoted heavily, the marketing campaign even featured a commercial with a still relatively unknown actor called Kevin Costner. The Lisa was originally aimed at businesses, but many of its features, such as using a mouse and the use of a graphical user interface or GUI, were adapted over to the iconic Macintosh. The Mac wouldn't come out until 1984, but it changed the way we use computers forever. And that all comes from the Apple Lisa from 1983. Also from Apple this year, the Apple IIe. The original Apple II was one of the gold standards for early personal computers. It was Apple's bread and butter. But like all technology, it quickly became dated. In 1983, the Apple IIe was a lighter and faster edition of its predecessor. In 1983, Coleco released the Coleco Adam, a machine perfect for students featuring a built-in printer. And that machine only cost $595. There was also a British inventor named Clive Sinclair, who was behind the Timex Sinclair 1500 and 2068. The merger between Sinclair and Timex was bringing us high-quality but lower-costing home computers. 1983 is the year when the PC starts to really drop in cost and begins to make sense for more and more people. Because of the success of the IBM PC 5150 released a few years earlier, its operating system from Microsoft, known as MS-DOS, quickly became the standard for desktop computing. As ComputerHistory.org shares, quote, Microsoft's licensing of MS-DOS to other hardware companies was laying the foundations for a new industry of aggressively priced, innovative IBM PC clones, unquote. For many consumers, by 1983, many new PC options were appearing, but they all ran on MS-DOS, helping Microsoft become one of the biggest and most successful companies in history. Speaking of software, 1983 is also important as it gave us the release of Lotus 1-2-3.
They're working with Lotus 1-2-3. Yeah. Lotus 1-2-3.
Lotus 1-2-3 was the software that seamlessly integrated spreadsheets, databases, and graphic functions on the IBM PC. This may seem simple today, but back in '83, turning data into a chart with just a keystroke was pretty mind-blowing. Lotus 1-2-3 was considered one of the very first killer apps and quickly became an industry standard. Also in the world of tech in 1983 came the release of the device that you're probably listening to me on right now. Back in 1973, Martin Cooper of Motorola did something that no human being had ever done before. On the streets of New York, he made the world's first cellular phone call. That, however, was only the first step. It would take more than 10 years of development for not only the device, but the network that would allow for cell phones to even work. In 1983, Motorola released the Dynatac 8000X, the world's very first commercial cell phone. Weighing in at around 2 pounds and with a 30-minute battery life that took 10 hours to charge, not everyone was convinced that this was a device that we even needed. It was also expensive, around $12,000 in today's money. It seemed like a product that only catered to the super rich, and it was embraced by them and those in the financial world. The Dynatac was the accessory of fictional characters like Gordon Gekko from the movie Wall Street, but the device from Motorola did start popping up. Being able to make a call on the go was a revolutionary advancement. The Dynatac 8000X was the must-have accessory for Zach Morris, and many kids of the 80s first became aware of a cell phone by watching Saved by the Bell. But like all technology, the cell phone began to shrink in size and it got less expensive. It's amazing to think how this giant brick phone evolved into the little supercomputer you now have in your pocket. The most important device of our modern time began all the way back in 1983. Speaking of tech, we move to the world of video games, and 1983 is probably the most tumultuous one in the industry's history. The video game market is about to have the bottom fall out of it. And this starts in November of 1982, as just in time for Christmas comes the video game version of the biggest film of all time. The anticipation was high, but when the E.T. Atari video game was finally inserted into Atari consoles nationwide, it was disappointment that emerged. The frustrating game was returned in droves, and the game represented a diminishing quality in video games and a lack of confidence by consumers. Not only were there now a lot of new consoles on the market, but so many inferior third-party games had flooded the video game market too. Video games were being made by everyone. Example: in 1983, an Atari 2600 game called Chase the Chuck Wagon was made by the Purina Dog Food Company. The backlash by consumers to all the inferior games was swift. People had had enough of the low quality. This is a time of high inflation and economic recession, and consumers were much more cautious about what they spent their money on. And after getting burned by game after inferior game, something had to give. The Foundation for Economic Education says that confidence in games was so low that consumers didn't even want to take a chance on top-shelf games with great characters, gameplay, development, and high ratings because they didn't want to get duped again. The video game industry, which was a $3.2 billion industry in 1983, dropped to just $100 million in less than 2 years. Big toy companies that had begun to get on board with video games, such as Hasbro and Mattel, pulled out, wanting nothing to do with them. This also caused a shift back to traditional toys like dolls and stuffed animals. But fortunately for video game fans, something significant was also released in 1983. Something that would end up saving the video game industry and changing it forever. Released in June of 1983, a new game created by a 100-year-old Japanese company hit arcades. Many in North America had never heard of Nintendo before, but their arcade game about two plumbers called Mario and Luigi who work in the sewers of New York became a big hit. The arcade game, simply called Mario Bros., was originally created as a spin-off of the Jumpman character from the Donkey Kong arcade game. This was our first introduction to one of the most important video game characters of not just the 1980s, but in the history of video games. It would be a few years until the release of the Nintendo Entertainment System, but little did we know that it was this company and their little character that would help rebound the video game crash of 1983 and take the industry to levels never imagined. 1983 is a huge year for TV, but it is all about one of the most important series finales and TV events of all time. In 1983 came one of the most watched shows in history. On February 28th, nearly 106 million people tuned in to watch the series finale of MASH. This would be the most watched TV show in history for an incredible 17 years until the Super Bowl in 2010. CNN reports that the Super Bowl record was just in total viewership because of a now larger population. MASH still had a higher rating and share and remains the most watched episode of a TV series ever. And in our changing landscape of television and content consumption, it's safe to say this ratings record will never be broken. Also in 1983 came one of the defining kids shows of the decade. We've already talked about cartoons, but this live-action show was a joint production between England, the US, and Canada. And it aired on a still fledgling cable channel called the Home Box Office, or HBO. It was the show that shared with us the importance of living together in harmony with one another and with our environment. I have a previous episode all about the history of Fraggle Rock, but the beloved Jim Henson creation played an instrumental part in the growth of HBO in the 1980s. Next is the show about 4 Vietnam vets framed for a crime they didn't commit. They can help you, if you can find them, that is. The A-Team debuted in January 1983, and it was unique as it was a primetime action show, but still directed at kids. It was violent, but more of a cartoony violence. And it made a huge star out of Lawrence Turod, aka Mr. T. The A-Team would run for 5 seasons on NBC, and for the first 3 seasons was always in the top 10 most watched shows. Some other decade-defining shows that came out in 1983 include Mama's Family, Wheel of Fortune, Reading Rainbow, The Joy of Painting, Webster, and Star Search. CBS continues to dominate network TV with 7 shows in the top 10. Let's take a look at the top 10 shows and their ratings. At number 1 is the powerhouse Dallas with a 25.7 rating. Not far behind at number 2 is 60 Minutes with a 24.2. At number 3, Dynasty with a 24.1 rating. The A-Team comes in at number 4 with a 24.0. At number 5, Simon & Simon, 23.8. At number 6, Magnum P.I. with a 22.4. 7th went to Falcon Crest, 22.0. At 8, Kate and Alley, 21.9. At number 9, Hotel with a 21.1. And rounding out the top 10, Cagney and Lacey with a 20.9 rating. Every year has its notable sporting moments, but 1983 might not be the most standout year ever when it comes to sports in the 80s. And this tends to happen when you're in the middle of an Olympic cycle. It had been a few years already since the Summer Olympics and then the Winter Olympics in Lake Placid, and we still had a year to wait for the Winter Olympics in Sarajevo and then the hotly anticipated Summer Olympics in Los Angeles. We're also coming off a World Cup year in 1982, so in 1983, there was a little sense of that letdown. But that doesn't stop the sporting world from giving us some incredible moments and memories. Here are some of those highlights. Wimbledon is won by John McEnroe and Martina Navratilova. The British Open is won by Tom Watson. Marvin Hagler defeats Robert Duran to retain his unified middleweight title. And Sonny's Halo wins the Kentucky Derby. 1983 is where we begin to see the continued domination of Wayne Gretzky and the Edmonton Oilers in the National Hockey League. Coming off one of the most astonishing seasons in sports history the season prior, in 1983, Gretzky was the league MVP and won the scoring title again, closing in on the 200-point mark. But the Oilers still couldn't take down the defending Stanley Cup champions, the New York Islanders. In the 1982-1983 season, the Islanders win their 4th Stanley Cup in a row. And as of the time of this recording, no major professional North American team has won 4 straight championships. But this would be the last time the Islanders would ever win it, and the Edmonton era would soon begin. To finish off the Big Four North American sports, Washington wins the Super Bowl, the Baltimore Orioles win the World Series, and the Philadelphia 76ers capture the NBA championship. So that's 1983, a year that was very significant both technologically and culturally. When you think of the importance of 1983 for the internet and the creation of the first cell phone, this is the year that's still with us right now. Those two critical innovations from 1983 are allowing you to listen to my voice wherever you are in the world through a computer you can carry in your pocket. From a pop culture standpoint, it's the year that signified a new era of cartoon shows, and some of the most popular of the decade and of all time came out. 1983 was a standout year for music, and network TV continued to be a cornerstone of our entertainment. We were only 3 years into a new decade, but the essence of the 1980s seems to have been solidly established in 1983. So that's our show. Thank you so much for listening. If you're looking for some further listening related to this episode, I have a bunch of previous episodes you can check out, including a show about the story of the first cell phone, an episode all about the IBM PC 5150 and the computer revolution of the 80s, an episode about the history of G.I. Joe, one about the historic MASH finale, an episode about the legendary Wayne Gretzky during the 80s, and an episode that looks back on the biggest album releases of 1983. But besides those ones, there are a ton of other previous episodes waiting for you to dive into. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to the Everything 80s podcast wherever you listen to podcasts so you don't miss out on new episodes. So thank you again so much for spending your time with me here today. I'm Jamie. This has been Everything 80s, but I'll be back soon with a new episode. Don't you dare miss it.